everybody. So we talked about technique, we talked about structure, and we're now in the part that I think you've all been waiting for, and that is emotion. And it's very, not as difficult for me to talk about this, but it's sort of the most tricky of the three to talk about without somebody getting upset somewhere. And the reason why I'm saying it because I wrote a big fat doctorate about the issues, what emotions and how emotions connect music and merging structure and emotion. So I know some people would like to reduce emotion to, oh, let's just make up a story and that's the end of it. And having spent the last 12 years developing the methodology and working with many different students and trying to integrate this part of the equation into their playing, I can tell you it's really not simple. We all get nervous on stage. It's hard to connect to the emotion when you're nervous. We all have different perspective on what the text is trying to communicate, so we come up with different bottom lines. Some people are open to that message, some people are not open to that message. So there's just, I'm going to I can be here for 3 days talking about it and I still won't get everything I want to say about it said. So for the purpose of this video, we're just going to do a very broad overview of the methodology, how I address things, and of course, there will be more videos in the future sort of breaking down these components into more manageable parts. So what I'm basically trying to say is bear with me. So just to recap, hopefully you can see this. 3 components to creating a convincing interpretation: the mastery of technique, mastery of musical structure, and mastery of emotion. We talked a lot about technique, the natural arm movements and how to avoid injury, how to interpret a passage technically and make sure that you can play it. So that's pretty simple, right? Then we talked about structure and how to analyze a piece and how to break down a phrase to see how the melodic contour, the harmonic progression, the rhythmic patterns, how they all combine and how one could interpret those to maximize the impact of the music. What normally is not discussed is the emotion component, and I like to use the metaphor or analogy of a plastic container or any container. Technique helps us build the container. Structure tells us how large or small or oval or rectangular the structure is going to be, the container is going to be, and emotion is the water that goes into the container. I think that to have a musical performance without emotion, without that water, is just not interesting and not compelling. So the basic assumption, just to be clear, is you need to be able to play. You need to be able to move your fingers and execute what music is on the page. You need to be able to understand the reason and the logic behind the music that you are performing. And 3, you need to be able to understand what was the emotional intention of the composer. Now, again, we're not mind readers. We can't go back in time and ask, but I think that the choice of harmony, of rhythm, of keys, of tempo indications, of articulation markers are all clues to tell us what the emotional intention in the music is. Again, the Hallelujah chorus was not written in minor for a reason. So if that's an argument that you want to have, please leave a comment below. But I think we can all agree that there are basic connotations and associations with keys, with harmonies, with intervals. Derek Cook wrote an incredible book about the connection between music and structure. And if you're interested, the entire doctorate is on my webpage. So if you go to Prescott and you click that, you will see there are 3 parts and you can read the entire document for yourself. And there's, of course, more information there. So yeah, I think so. We said that. The methodology that I've invented is sort of divided into 5 parts. Like you remember the 5 frames in this technique, sort of similar breakdown here to 5 different steps. And I'll use this visual aid over here. Sorry for a lot of traffic today in New York. The big circle is the overall definition or overall I call it emotional embrace, but you can come up with just a general title for the piece. What is the piece trying to express? And I'm going to be simplistic here by saying it is happy. Is it happy or is it sad? Is it tragic or is it elated? So you're probably going, what the heck? I know if a piece is happy or I know if a piece is sad. Do I really need to articulate it? And of course, to some degree, we all intuitively know what the music is about. But my experience has shown that in some very specific cases, people were really confused about what the music is trying to say. Is it a love song or is it a prayer? Is it a funeral march or is it, just, a deep form of depression? I think that just going through the basic step of trying to figure out the overall meaning, like where exactly the entire piece is going at, is so incredibly important and so critical. And again, people, I won't say get it wrong, but people make some very strange decisions sometimes. I have an example here where I was playing a group of 4 Scarlatti sonatas, and this is, again, it's not the best representation, but the E major was sort of, light and airy and flowing. The B minor sonata is very, very dark. The D minor, the repetition is very angry and very fierce. And then the C major was much lighter and again, more pastoral in nature. This sort of diagramming of saying piece A is here, piece B is over here, and they're different, and I'm going to have to make a transition between it, I think was so helpful to me. In fact, I'm playing now a cello recital with Dr. Farney, and we discovered we have actually 3 laments or 3 funeral marches in the program that deal with death. So just understanding that and knowing that we're going to have to space them out in the program in such a way that they're going to have maximum impact on the audience, but we're not just going to take them through the same sort of emotional world 3 times, like right after the other. Hopefully that makes sense. So the first step is just to come up with a general description for the piece. And you can be as specific as you want or as general as you want. It's just to sort of plug you where is the piece going to go. The second step is doing an analysis of the piece. And by analysis, I mean just knowing that, for example, if you're in a sonata form, that you know the first section, the first theme, the bridge, the second theme, the development, how things are constructed there. And then taking that understanding and sort of mapping out the emotions. So I call that stations. And what you see in the circle is a division of positive emotions and negative emotions. And let's say the first theme is sort of positive, lovely, things are going well. Then the second theme goes down into something negative, and then the coda ends up in a positive state. For me, the visual of seeing this line, and again, you could of course do it mentally, you don't have to draw anything, but seeing that motion of it's going down, or it's going up, was really, really important. It was very, I say moving is the wrong word, but critical in allowing me to understand where I would get stuck. And guess what? I got stuck on transitions. And in fact, many of my memory slips I discovered would happen on transition, during a transition. Either I wouldn't want to leave the emotional state I was in, or that I couldn't make the leap to the next emotion because I didn't prepare for it. So I think the graphic representation of this motion between, are we going up or down? Are we going from the love theme to the anger theme to what's happening in between them, I think is really, really incredibly important. You see underneath these what I call the emotional centers, and that is the reason why we are moving from one emotion to another. And this is really where I would say the battle commences with musicologists and theoreticians who say that there is no causal connection. The fact that the composer chose theme A for the first theme and they chose theme B for the second theme, that's just a choice they made, and there's not necessarily a connection between them. I strongly disagree. I think composers know what they're doing, and I think if they chose as the first theme and then for the second theme, I think they know what they're doing. The contrast is a part of the composition, and the resolution of that contrast is what the piece is all about. So the emotional center sort of gives you the connection between those two things. Why was I in state one in the beginning, and why am I in now state two later on? Now that can be as simple as, I met the love of my life and I'm happy, and now the love of my life dumped me and I'm sad. That would give you that motion. Or I got a new job and then I got fired. That would give you that transition. But the point I'm trying to make, and I hope this doesn't come across as being simplistic, but doing these kind of transitions on stage when you're playing very, very difficult music can become a very, very difficult task. We don't like moving between emotions. We don't like, especially going from positive to negative. That's very, very difficult. And frankly, the opposite is true too. Going from very negative to very positive is difficult as well. So just knowing these things and identifying the emotion and knowing what's the reason behind it, why am I doing X here and I'm doing Y here, really opens up a performance, in my opinion. So that's the second step. The third step is deciding on the boundary for the pieces. And to be honest with you, in the last 12 years of doing this, I sort of let go of the idea of identifying clear boundaries, just because I found that if you know what the emotion is and you know where you're going, you sort of figure out the boundaries of that emotion already. But just to be clear and consistent here, if a piece is angry, how angry are you going to get? If a piece is about love, how much love are you going to put? Is it over the top, or is it just a very intimate, sincere expression of that emotion? So the deciding how much you're going to put into the piece is critical, and also dependent, of course, on the style of the composition. What you do with Schumann is not what you're going to do with Beethoven. Not what you're going to do with Mozart is not what you're going to do with Bach. So it is important to decide on the boundaries, but in most cases, once you identify what the emotion is, I think you will be already establishing those boundaries. The fourth step is, how do we connect to this emotional wave and to this story? And I'm going to discuss the fifth step in tandem, because the fifth step is how we disconnect from it. And the reason why I have both steps in there is because the point of all of this is not, I'm self-editing here, is not to overwhelm the audience and overwhelm yourself with emotion. It's not a therapy session, especially not when you're going on stage as a concert artist. It's about, like I said earlier, it's about putting that emotion into the piece and bringing it to life. And the question of amount here is critical. If you are too connected to the emotion, let's say you chose to connect to the funeral march by thinking of somebody very close to you, like a parent who died. If that emotional memory is too intense, then you're going to go on stage, you're going to have a problem, because you're not going to want to connect to that emotion. So we need to find this very delicate balance between being able to connect to the music by finding a personal connection to it, but also being able to put it in perspective and making sure that it does not overwhelm the entire composition. And that balance is sometimes tricky, sometimes not so tricky. It depends on the piece, and it depends on the way you chose to connect to the piece. So I'm going to say two things, or one thing. When you choose the story or the connection or the way to get into the specific emotion, ask yourself, is this something that I can access under pressure when I'm on stage, or is this going to be too difficult? Some solutions here are, choose something that happened in the past, so not something that happened last month or today or last week, and something that you feel you have enough detachment from that you're going to be able to work with that memory, get the emotion out, convey it into the music, and then the music is not going to suffer from it, and you're going to feel in control. Another solution is to take a movie star or just a fictitious character, and I apologize again for the noise, a fictitious character that is going to embody the story for you. So the advantage of that is if no, I'm thinking Brad Pitt, but if Brad Pitt is your character for the piece, he's going through the funeral march, then it's not you. You embody him with the emotion you're trying to express, and all is well. The downside of it is that sometimes by projecting those emotions on a fictitious character, you sort of lose the connection to the emotion altogether, and that obviously not going to work. So it works sometimes, not always. Play with it, see how it works for you. Yeah, I think that's sort of a very, very quick overview of the entire thing, and I'm going to change some angles here and going to give you some more specific examples, okay? Okay, so I'm back and I'm here to give you a little bit of an insight or examples or whatever you want to call it about how to go about doing this emotional understanding of music methodology. So as you can see in this beautiful graph, this is Chopin Mazurka Opus 17 number 4 in A minor, and if you don't know the piece, get thyself a good recording and listen to it, because it's probably for sure one of my favorite mazurkas. It's stunning, beautiful, earth-shattering. Yeah. So what I want to quickly show you here is how this graph over here sort of helps us identify what the piece is trying to do, and then how to follow it with our own emotional understanding and expression. What you can see here is that there's a short introduction that I labeled as O1 and O2, and because these beginnings, prologue and epilogue, if you will, are really sort of detached. They sound like this. To me, they really feel like they belong in a different piece or in a different time. And then the piece actually starts. And so on and so forth. So overall, I think people would agree that this piece is very nostalgic, it's very sad, and that throughout the entire composition you could see that I've broken it into three major areas. There is the first two pages, the first two pages that have 4 or 3 repetitions, then the fourth is here, but it has 3 repetitions of the main theme, and then a contrasting section here, then the trio or the B section, which is 4 repetitions of the same emotion, but it intensifies. So you can see as it grows up in joy or happiness or whatever you want to call it. And then this is, I think, really what I wanted to talk about, because I think this is really the interesting part, and this is where this methodology becomes really helpful to see the dip between the climax of the piece, that really high expression of joy, and this complete, abrupt, very sudden change in emotion into, you want to call it catastrophe or a broken heart or a moment of realization. But this line over here is what I would say this methodology is good for, is to show you where, even though in the music, and I'm going to show you right here, even though in the music it looks like nothing happens between this measure and this measure, a world happens, and you can see it here in the graph. If I'm playing somewhere over here, you hear this theme. So you can see this theme repeats 4 times. Every time it's, in my opinion, it should be a little bit more thrilling and excited. And by the time you get here, and that takes us back. I apologize for the playing, it's not very good, but I think you get the picture. There's an entire page of building optimism, and if you want to think of Mazurka, you want to think of the dance, and the joy builds up, only to be demolished in these 2 measures. Now, what does that mean in terms of the interpretation? In the document I wrote, I talk about different ways of connecting to it, and one interpretation, of course, is longing for one's homeland, which we know Chopin was living in Paris, living in France, was constantly reminiscing and missing his homeland of Poland. So that would be a very appropriate interpretation if you can relate to it, if you feel that nostalgia and love for your homeland. Or another interpretation, of course, is a relationship where you're reminiscing and you're thinking about the loved one, and the heart gets broken in this transition over here. Now, what I'm hoping you get from all of this is not a simplistic, oh, I just need to think about an X and everything is going to be fine. But anytime we talk about emotions, we run the risk of making things sound simplistic and trivial. But they really aren't. What we're doing with this is we're just creating a framework, a terminology, a reference point for us to try and understand the piece from the emotional perspective, and not only just from the musical structural perspective. There is an incredible difficulty here in expressing a very intimate, a very fragile, a very sensitive piece, and going through all of these emotions where we go from the sadness of that main theme, which is and that repeats 4 times, and I think each one of these 4 times offers us an opportunity to do something slightly different, so we don't have to repeat exactly the same way. I see it as progressively descending and getting sadder and sadder, but of course somebody can see it in a different way, and say either that they're the same or that maybe they get less and less emotional, less and less involved. Yeah, I think this is all I want to say about this, but just so you get an impression of how the whole thing works together, if you're doing this on a piece you're working on, you would come up with one that's sort of the general description of the piece. For me, for the Mazurka, sad, nostalgic, homesick, I think would be the words that I would use. Then we identify sort of the appearances of the main themes, and place them according to negative and positive emotions. And I know somebody is going to say, well, how do you know that anger is more negative than sadness, or that love is higher on the graph than joy? It's not science, this is not math, and there is no right and wrong. It's really how you feel the emotions progress and move from one another. I think what's more important is how they relate to one another in themselves, and how they relate between the positive and the negative, and that you see those switches. Yeah, I think that's it on this. I'm going to quickly look here at some notes that I have about, just to give you some ideas about where this methodology can come in handy. So one point that I want to make is about opening measures. And I know from my experience, this has always been the most difficult, because going on stage, your hands are probably cold, and you have to jump in and either play something super happy like, or something very emotional, very profound, and you have to sort of, I'm sorry, there's a lot of noise outside. Music is wonderful. Okay, so, and you have to make sure that those first notes are actually in the right place on the graph. If it's super happy and joyful, then it needs to be up here. If it's very tragic and very soulful, then it needs to be somewhere here. And how do we aim at that opening? How do we make sure that we actually nail that emotion, nail the composer intention for the beginning of the piece, when we are still just trying to get our fingers to move on the instrument? So I think this graph is really helpful in at least telling you where you're supposed to be aiming at. And of course, the first time it's not going to be exactly right, and the second time and the third time, but maybe by the 4th time, when you go on stage and you think, this is what I'm trying to express, it's actually going to happen by using a specific image or specific connecting point. Maybe a word of caution here, that I know I tell my students all the time, it's never going to feel the same way it feels in the practice room on stage. So whatever connection and emotion you're feeling in the practice room, and you're probably feeling it very intensely, it's probably not going to come, how can I say this? It's probably not going to be felt to the same extent on the stage, because other things are happening on stage. And I will say that once we've entered all of this information into our playing in the practice room, some of it will stay with us on stage. The trajectory, the motion between these events will stay. And with experience, you can get it closer to what you want and be more effective. And of course, it's not something that I would want to go on stage and experiment with and invent a whole new interpretation in front of an audience. It's something that you probably need to prepare for and make sure you know where you're heading in advance. So the first point is opening measures, always difficult, but if you have an idea of where you're going, there's a better chance that you're actually going to hit it. We talked already about transition, so I'm not going to talk too much about it, but really identifying where you're going to and from is critical. Yeah, I think we've made that point. Peak points and climaxes. I know from my experience, I guess I want to talk about Rachmaninoff third, is that to get to that cadenza in the first movement and to feel that you really, how can I say this? That you have the right ammunition on you to get to that height of and lows of intensity, you really need to have a good reason. You really need to think about what it is that has brought me to this point, that I'm screaming my heart and lungs and head off with all of these chords and all of that intensity. And the beauty of it is that if you set it up right, you're already hinting at it as you play the opening measures, and by the time you get to the cadenza, it's just an escalation of what you've already stated. But my point is that you need to know how far the piece is going to go. You need to know what's the ultimate, deepest, darkest, and of course, what's the highest, most positive point in the piece in order to do it justice. When I talk to students about it, I call it opening the piece. We need to know where the piece starts, where the piece ends, what's the highest point, and what's the lowest point. And what that does, it's sort of, if you think in terms of a canvas, it opens up the picture. It tells us where we're going to start, where we're going to end, and how wide the canvas is going to be. If you're playing this Chopin Mazurka, you know that the duration of it is actually very short. When we start, we're going to be in sort of a dream state where it sounds very positive and very welcoming. And as the piece progresses, we're going to understand that this opening is really just a mirage, a dream, a hallucination, if you will, of being detached from this very sad and intense mazurka. The highest point is the expression of joy. The lowest point happens here. Let me play a little bit of that for you. Sort of the disillusionment. That wasn't bad enough, you have to do it again. Yeah, so peak point and climaxes, if you know how high and how low you're going to go, you're probably going to do it better than if you're just hoping for the best. Wasn't that profound? Yeah. Yeah, endings, I guess, I don't really have much to say about it. It has to be proportionate to the beginning. So whatever you've established here, the ending has to make sense. I guess that's not very profound. Oppositional phrases. Oppositional phrases are phrases that start in one emotion and then go into a different emotion. And that can get tricky. Here I have a visual for you. You see this is the famous clarinet fantasy piece, which starts very, very happy and optimistic, and then of course drops to despair, and I'm going to find the music so I can play it for you. Hold on. Okay, so in this Schumann example, he starts in this beautiful sort of easygoing melody, and then takes a very dark turn. So that's an example of an oppositional phrase where we're starting in one state, we go into dark mode at the ending of it, then we go back to the major state or the happy state, and we conclude in a dark spot again. Why is that difficult? Because we have to come up with a reason of why we're going in between those 2 points. Why are we starting in a sort of sunny, beautiful tune and we end up in a very dark place? What is Schumann trying to say? How can we connect to it? And I don't want to open this too much right now just because it will be endless, but just an example of what an oppositional phrase could do and how important it is for us to identify it as one and then figure out what exactly is happening there and how we can connect to it. Just very quickly, I want to mention sarcasm because especially in 20th century music and obviously 21st century music, we will sometimes have music that is not actually conveying what we think it is conveying, meaning the composer is actually putting layers in the music. And if you know Shostakovich's music, that's what comes to me right now. That's a perfect example of where those happy-go-lucky melodies are really not happy-go-lucky. It's really something quite sinister, and there's an underbelly or a layer there of emotional understanding that you have to have in order to play that music accurately. So just keep in mind that sometimes what you see on the page is not that emotion. It's actually something else masquerading as that emotion. So just to keep that in mind. So I apologize if this video was not as articulate as the others, but I think it gives you a good introduction into all of it. And of course, I'll post more videos with more specific examples. And please, please, please feel free to leave questions below if you have something that you would like to learn more about. And I will see you in the next video. Bye.